So today we're going to render some duck fat. I butchered a duck a couple of days ago and I made a separate video about making duck stock, and that procedure can be used for making virtually any stock. And as a result of butchering the duck, I have here a lot of duck fat that I took off of the duck. I trimmed as much of it off as I could so it wouldn't end up in my stock. Now we're going to render this, which means basically just getting it to melt down into fat. We'll also be left at the end with crispy duck skins, duck cracklins, which our Siberian Husky just loves. We're going to put them into a fairly large pan here so that they have room to, essentially they're going to fry, and they're going to kind of lightly deep fry in their own fat as the fat renders. So what are you going to do with this duck fat? Well, you might make duck confit, you might fry things in it. Some restaurants now have duck fat fries. And it might sound kind of decadent, but it's actually not as bad for you as it might sound. It's about 50% mono unsaturated fat, which is the good fat. It's about 30% saturated fat, which is the bad fat. And it actually is about 10% omega-3 and 6. Now we're going to start with a medium flame here, and we are going to just let them start to cook, and we'll come back in a little while and check the temperature and see if it's too high or too low. So the duck skin here has only been cooking for a few minutes on medium heat. You can see that the fat is starting to render in the pan, and you know, there's no real reason to loosen them up. I tend to get them to release a little bit. You don't really have to do that. You can see they're starting to brown a little bit on the bottom, and some, you know, this pan isn't exactly level, so some areas aren't getting as much of the fat as others. But you can see we're already getting a lot of duck fat in the pan, and that eventually will be what we're going for to get out of this, in addition to the duck cracklins for the dog. We'll come back and check again in a little bit. So you can see that these duck skins are rendering nicely. We're about 8 minutes into the process, and I have not adjusted the heat. We still have a medium heat, and now you can see that the fat is starting to get deep, and so that's why you end up with cracklins at the end, because the skin is essentially deep frying as the fat builds up in the pan. Turning the pan a little bit so that low spots in the pan or high spots in the pan can now get the fat building up that they weren't really getting before. You can see in this pan on this stove that the fat tends to go toward the right side. Let's see if we can adjust that by turning the pan a little bit. Yeah. So here we are 5 minutes later. You can see that the fat is getting fairly deep here, and the pieces are really nicely browned on the bottom. They're heading toward having very nice cracklins. Now what we're going to do now is I'm going to let them cook for a while, and I will come back when they are finished, and I'll tell you how long it took overall. So here it is 5 minutes later, and I think they are finished. It has been 20 minutes total since I started. You can see that the skins are nicely browned. Let's get a sizzle plate here and pick these out. Also, the fat is starting to smell a little smoky, which means it's done, it's ready. So we're going to take these out, and then we're going to let the fat, we're going to turn the heat off and remove the pan from the burner so that the fat can start to cool down. And then once it's cool enough, we will take it out of the pan and store it. So we'll come back when the fat is a bit cooler. So here we are at the end. It's been an hour and a half since I turned off the heat and removed the duck fat from the heat. It's had plenty of time to cool. Here's the finished cracklins. They're nice and firm and crispy. Dog will love them. Now we're going to strain the strain the fat into a container. I use these Talente gelato containers. Great gelato, even better containers. And but they're plastic, so make sure your fat is well cooled before you try to put it in here, otherwise you'll have a terrible plastic and duck fat mess on your hands. So use a little strainer here, and we're going to pour the duck fat through the strainer into the container. I'm going to use a spatula and try to scrape as much as we can out of here. I hate to waste anything. Scrape that right into the strainer, and then that can stay in the fridge or the freezer. I keep it in the freezer for indefinitely. Here's a sample of some that I made quite a while ago. You can see that most of the fat is pretty like a cream colored, but you will get some darker areas in the fat if there were any maybe some burned areas or some meat maybe that rendered some juices into the fat and didn't fully evaporate. So you might get some dark coloration like that, but it's all usable for whatever you want. So that is the conclusion of rendering duck fat and making duck cracklins.